Process, winner of 15 New York and Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights.
Detectives arrested Lee Anthony Evans, age 56, of Irvington, and Philander Hampton, age 53, of Jersey City, for the alleged murders of the 5 teenage boys that went missing in Newark back in the summer of 1978.
It was the ultimate real-life cold case. 5 Newark teens who simply vanished. No trace, few clues. Now, 32 years later, the case is finally said to be solved. 2 men charged with killing the 5 on the night they disappeared. What it means for a city. What it may suggest for other unsolved murders. Up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. And by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by the PSCG Foundation and the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation.
It may have been the coldest case ever. 5 Newark kids who got together one summer night and never got back home. A mystery that haunted a city, but may now be solved after 32 years. I'm Raymond Brown, and on the docket for this edition of Due Process, the cold case phenomenon. It's launched special units in police departments across the country and even a hit TV show. But in these tough economic times, do cold case units pay off? Can they actually find answers to crimes that went unsolved decades before? These questions and more here in the studio. But first, Sandra King with some background on Newark's ultimate cold case. Sandy, do we know what happened to these 5 boys?
Well, Raymond, prosecutors and police say yes, that they know how and where the boys were killed and by whom. But both men have entered pleas of not guilty. One has been released on reduced bail. The other may be backing off a confession he's alleged to have made, a confession at the heart of the prosecution's case. As the eyes and the heart of a city have returned to 1978 and the mystery of those 5 lost boys. It was every mother's worst nightmare. Your kid heads out one summer night for a game of pickup basketball and never gets back home.
I wonder, I worry, I think, I cry, but I never give up hope.
That was one woman's grief for one missing son, 10 years after he'd vanished.
Nobody knew nothing. And that's when the nightmare began.
Now multiply that grief by 5. 5 mothers of 5 teenage boys, all of whom disappeared that night in 1978.
Once the missing person case begins to take on a longer and longer and longer time, you know in your heart of hearts that this is not good.
And so the 10-year mystery of 1988?
It's certainly the most baffling case that I've seen or even heard about.
Turned into 32. More than 3 decades without an answer, without an arrest, until this.
Approximately 8:15 p.m., detectives from the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, the Newark Police Department, the New Jersey State Police, arrested Lee Anthony Evans, age 56, of Irvington, and Philander Hampton, age 53, of Jersey City, for the alleged murders of the 5 teenage boys that went missing in Newark back in the summer of 1978.
But the Lily Williams who was praying for answers when we talked 22 years ago was still not sure she had found them.
I want to see some facts about my son being dead, or where he is, or what happened to him.
Because while authorities say they do know what happened, there are no bodies. And the house where they were said to be killed is long gone, along with whoever was inside.
The boys were corralled at gunpoint and restrained. It is further alleged that the home was then set on fire and the boys perished in the blaze.
And so there were at last arrests and arraignments and indictments in a city
We never forgot.
and a police force that had been haunted for more than 30 years.
We constantly worked very hard on it, so it's something that has been gnawing at me for years and years and years. You think about it all the time. When you look at 5 young people who disappear.
And when it seemed that the boys might be forgotten, a Newark lawyer, Bill Manns, began a campaign of remembrance, a campaign he led until his death 2 years ago.
We met with the detectives, we met with the families, and just let the parents know that there are people out there in their corner working on their behalf, trying to get some answers to what happened to their sons, to their brothers, to their cousins, to their friends.
All the while doubting that police were doing all they could to solve the case.
They really dropped the ball in this case.
A charge authorities emphatically deny.
I can't see how anybody would say that. That means that they obviously don't know the blood, sweat, and tears that people put into this case over the last 32 years. That's just not having a good grasp of the facts. We just needed that one extra break that would put us over the top.
A break that came when one of the accused killers allegedly confessed to a brother of one of the boys.
And what did he say?
He told me something.
Did he confess to you?
Yes.
And now, with Lee Evans and Philander Hampton facing trial for the murders, the word being used most often is closure.
Closure for the families, I think, is the single most important thing here. Bringing these men to justice is probably second.
If you don't bring closure to the families, it kind of, it makes you feel like you're a failure. You know, you failed that family, you failed that community.
In a situation like this, there is never closure. There's always that open wound.
Even with the arrest, there's no closure. If someone came forward and they confessed to the crime, why didn't they come forward years ago?
Partial closure, but knowing that these gentlemen are going to be coming to trial, and once the trial is over and there is a conviction, I'm sure there'll be closure.
Of course, there is never a guarantee of conviction, especially when there's no forensic evidence, no weapons, no crime site, no witness, no bodies. And if the prosecution should prove unsuccessful, what about those families who've been told that they should, at last, Raymond, have closure?
The potential gains and losses, benefits and pitfalls of cold case probes when we come back, so stay with us.
I remember that case. I was young at the time, back in the 70s, but it was something that was very much on the hearts and minds of the people.
I have 2 kids, and if one of my kids died, I'd never, especially if somebody killed them, I'd never get over that.
By this time, it should have been solved already.
32. That's a travesty. Why so long?
I think the investigators should have did a better job with getting witnesses and putting out more information.
I think it's good that the crime will ultimately not go unsolved.
Better late than never. I mean, if no one had gotten arrested, the case would still be open and, you know, pending and a big question mark over it. So better late than never.
But as a criminal defense attorney, I'm the first one to tell you that arrests and indictments do not remove that big question mark. In the case of the 5 boys missing 32 years, no one has yet been proven guilty. But here to shed some light on both the Newark case and the increasing national concentration on cold case probes, Fordham Law Professor James Cohen, a one-time public defender who teaches criminal defense. former Somerset County Prosecutor Wayne Forrest, who started as a detective, then deputy prosecutor in the State Attorney General's office. And with us from Newark, Terry Lawson, sister of Michael McDowell, one of the 5 boys who disappeared 3 decades ago. Welcome to all of you. Terry, I'm going to start with you. It obviously has to be a tremendous personal challenge to live with this grief and sadness for 32 years. At the end of the day, while I'm sure you'd like to see a trial, is there any emotional cost involved in having to revisit this issue intensely now, 3 decades after it took place?
Yes, it's definitely emotional. We knew that once an arrest was made that the process of a trial would take place and that we would learn some things that we didn't know before. For a long time, you know, for 30 years, it's been an emotional roller coaster throughout the entire investigation.
Let me ask you to assume what for you may be a very painful thing, that there's a trial and both of these men are acquitted. Will you still think it was worth it to have gone through the process of having the case come up again and deal with these painful memories?
It's we don't even want to think that both of these men will be acquitted, because we knew in our hearts and hearts from back in 1978 that at least one of these men were the guilty party. And if man can't give him justice, God will.
Wayne, let me turn to you, because we asked Terry about emotional costs, but there's also a public policy cost. For example, you had a cold case unit that you ran in your office. It was pretty aggressive. I think you told me not long ago that the first 4 cases you started out to solve, you didn't, but you had other successes. But how do you measure the success or failure of a unit like that? Is it a dollar and cents measure?
No, you can't look at it that way. Obviously, you can't put a dollar figure on solving a case, especially a homicide. The cases that we put into our cold case unit were all homicide cases. And we also did it in an economical way. We began with just assigning new detectives, new prosecutors to the case, get new eyes looking at the case file. They'd come up with some new ideas to pursue. We would take all the evidence, resubmit it to a lab, maybe the same lab, maybe a different lab. Technology has changed. We may get a lead that way. We would re-interview witnesses at the time, new witnesses that may have developed, and then possibly even go back to the suspect, either interview that suspect directly or through a confidential informant or a undercover.
I've read that some jurisdictions around the country that law enforcement people are saying it's too expensive. Do you think that, as a general view, is a short-sighted view, a view that's too oriented to dollars and cents, or do you think it's always going to be a question of whether there's real social value in this?
I guess it depends on the number of cases you want to assign to the cold case unit. We kept it to a manageable minimum number of cases, and it never cost us a lot of money.
Now, Jim, when legislature in New Jersey and really around the country said there's no statute of limitations on murder, they obviously consider that it's always worth pursuing a murder trial if it's possible. On the other hand, are there consequences in terms of your ability to get a fair trial from a case that's 32 years old?
The answer is yes. There are serious consequences, given that everything is stale. Even in the particular case that you're focusing on, the confession was made 18 months ago, the supposed confession, to somebody else, and that's old, even though it seems to be community knowledge that these individuals were involved in some way in the disappearance of the boys.
And how does that affect the defense? If there's a defense counsel and a defendant trying to meet the charges, are there practical consequences that might undermine at least your perception of the ability for the trial to be fair?
There are very serious practical consequences that will almost inevitably, not quite, undermine the possibility of a fair trial. Just memories fade. Memories can get distorted in all sorts of different ways, and that kind of thing undermines the possibility of a fair trial.
Wayne, on the other hand, I do know prosecutors who have said in conversation, casual conversation, not people assigned to this case, it's a tough case for the state's point of view. Jurors now increasingly are expecting some kind of forensic evidence. They want fingerprints or some other scientific evidence, and you have maybe one confession and a couple of other statements, not the kind of case that you dream of as a prosecutor from the point of view of winning.
It's, we've all heard of the CSI effect that is now imposed on prosecutors. And most prosecutors will tell you as any case gets older, it becomes more difficult. There comes a time, though, with some of the older cases, which is why we have the cold case squad, where some things may be a little bit better, but still it's a difficult position to be in for a prosecutor to try an old case. I tried a 25-year-old homicide case in Camden, and it's very, very difficult to do.
Terry, let me turn to you, because one of the questions discussed in Sandy's report was the question of whether the police had been diligent enough. I had the sense that you felt that the family and others in the community had focused on these particular defendants early on. Is it your view that law enforcement in Essex County and in Newark was diligent and sufficiently aggressive in pursuing these cases back at the time the killings took place?
I think that in the beginning that they missed a lot of evidence. I think that they missed a lot of opportunities to bring this case close earlier on. Over the years, yes, the detectives has been diligent. However, I think that they did not pursue the suspects. They allowed them that time and that space, which had dragged on for the 32 years. And
let me ask you this. Let me ask you the tough question. If initially they weren't aggressive enough, law enforcement, do you think it was incompetence, the fact that these were black kids from Newark? Were there questions of class? And what do you think, in your heart of hearts, was the reason there wasn't sufficient aggressive movement early on?
Well, I believe that, for one, when they didn't even take the report for a day and a half later, and it's automatically assumed that 5 black boys from Newark ran away. 5 black boys from Newark don't run away. They disappeared. Something happened to these boys. So right away, they missed the opportunity there. And obviously, they missed the fire, which we had no idea that took place until the arrests were made. So yes, I do feel that they missed a lot of opportunities early on.
Let me ask you this. Do you think, Jim, that the question of how much resources are focused on these issues relate to whether or not the person is a person that's known, whether there are questions of class, race, and caste that factor into the decision about how much resources to put in initially, and over time, how committed you stay with this?
I think it's a well-known, I'll call it a fact, but understanding that some people will disagree, that fewer resources are put into the initial investigation, typically, when people of color are involved in terms of being missing or being killed. Media attention to those kinds of cases is statistically less than it is when the person is not a person of color.
So this might have been an international story had the victims been people of status or of different color.
If they had been of different color or people of status, this would have been solved, in my judgment, many, many years ago.
Wait, let me ask you a more technical question that bears on this issue. If a house burns down in a suburban neighborhood where the lawns are manicured and people have some resources and political influence, there would probably be somebody sifting through the ashes to see if there are bones, if there are people who've been inside. Although this was an abandoned building, we know people sleep in abandoned buildings, and apparently nobody really did a thorough analysis, not knowing automatically that it's connected to this investigation. Do those kinds of use of public resources, do they have a caste or a class implication in terms of how they're used and how aggressively things like that are pursued?
I think it's more the fact that over the years, all our different units have become more sophisticated. Our arson squads today are made up of highly trained arson detectives along with highly trained arson investigators from the firefighting community. We have more equipment and techniques to do arson investigations. And depending on where it occurs, if it occurred in a place like Somerset County where I was prosecutor, we have more time to put into it because we're not going from case to case as the Newark Police and the Essex County Prosecutor has to do. So there's a lot of factors that are involved here, and I think it involves more as time has gone by, law enforcement has become more sophisticated in investigating all types of crimes.
Now, I don't want to compare Essex and Somerset in some unfair way, but in Somerset County, had there been a building that burned down and was abandoned, an abandoned building had been burned down, would somebody have gone through and made sure whether or not there were bodies inside as a means either of connecting it to an arson investigation or seeing more about the human cost?
Well, going back 32 years, I don't know. Much smaller prosecutor's office, small police departments. Many of our police departments didn't even exist at the time. So I really couldn't tell you that that would be the case.
Terry, going back over the years, what's been the community sentiment about this case? And I know you can't speak for the whole community of Newark, but to the extent that folks outside the immediate families of these young men were interested or concerned about the case, was there a feeling or connected to this case or the investigation?
You know, this case has been in the minds of the people in the community. I live and work in this community practically all my life, and I meet people today that say, I remember the day this happened. They remember the stories whenever the media gave it attention, and they have been great supporters for the families. We definitely know that in the community that everyone, this has affected the community because people were overprotected of their children back then. You know, they felt like if 5 black boys could disappear in Newark, then, you know, they wanted the curfews changed, be in the house at 6 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock. So parents became more protective of their children because we thought someone was out there snatching our kids. We knew our children didn't just run away.
Jim, let me turn to a question that might seem technical, but I think the viewers would be interested in it. At the time Mr. Evans was granted bail, the prosecutor made comments to the effect that the danger he posed to the community wasn't considered. New Jersey has a bail statute that focuses on risk of flight. That is, a judge has to decide, is the defendant going to come back for trial? There's a federal statute, and other states have statutes where the defendant's potential danger to the community is a factor to be considered. What do you think about that in terms of how those statutes play, and what do you think is the likelihood that the legislature here might change?
Well, first of all, I've never known a judge, even in jurisdictions in which the risk of future dangerousness is not on the table to be specifically considered, not to consider it.
You're saying judges are considering things that they say they're not considering?
That's correct. I'm saying that a judge looks out there and says, is this person going to go out and do it again? In this particular case, there doesn't seem to have been any in-between conduct, that is, in between 1978 and here. At least we haven't heard of any. And the reduction of bail from $5 million to $1 million is a suggestion, I think, that the judge doesn't think the case is very strong.
Terry, I want to ask Wayne a question about this, but when you heard about the bail reduction for Evans, did you have an emotional response to that?
I was very angry to find out that the judge had made that decision because I was in the courtroom approximately a week prior to this bail reduction where Mr. Evans was very defiant and became even a little angry, and that's when he fired his attorney in the courtroom. So it really showed that this man can be a danger. So when I went in on that day that he was granted that reduction, I was more than shocked to find out after the judge had seen the prior behavior in the courtroom. So anger, frustration, but I'm still not going to give up.
Okay. Wayne, let me turn to you. I guess we have 2 questions on the table. One is, do you agree with Jim that even though our statute doesn't permit a judge to take dangerousness into account, the judges have assumed from some common sense view that even though the legislature doesn't empower them to do so, they're going to take that into account? Do you think that happens?
I do. Okay. I do think that's a consideration.
And secondly, because although you're not actually in political life directly, your antennae are pretty good, what's the likelihood that the legislature would really look at our statute and change the factors that a judge takes into account?
I don't know the answer to that at this point.
All right. If you're elected to the legislature, what would your vote be? I think I can guess, but...
It would be to do that.
Is it fair when dangerousness is taken into account to the accused? We know that the community interest is now being taken into account, but can it work in unfairness to an accused?
It can work in unfairness because the literature on dangerousness and the ability to predict future dangerousness is very, very mixed. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine a judge, as a practical matter, not taking that into consideration in setting bail.
Okay. Terry, the last word to you. Is there anything that we as a community or a state or a nation can learn from this experience? Is there one thing that you would say to everybody who's watching that we should learn from this?
I think that the legislation should be changed because the bail was set for
I didn't mean to restrict the bail, but I meant overall, is there something we could learn from this experience?
This is something that we're just going to have to wait and see how the outcome is because it's so unusual that, you know, it's hard to determine what can happen and what the end result is going to be.
Thank you. Gentlemen, quickly, will the result in this case influence the handling of cold cases in New Jersey or nationwide, do you think?
Well, it could. I mean, I read about what the Newark Police and Prosecutor's Office did. They put in a tremendous effort.
Okay. And Jim, I need a yes or no from you.
No.
No. Okay. Well, it sounds like from Terry's comments we might have occasion to reconvene on this issue. But at the moment, with my thanks to Fordham Law Professor Jim Cohen, to Terry Lawson in Newark, and to former Somerset Prosecutor Wayne Forrest, that's it for this edition of Due Process. But we'll be back next week with the law and justice stories that you simply won't find elsewhere. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
For more than 3 decades, the residents of the city of Newark have been mystified by the disappearance of 5 teenage boys from the streets of the city one hot summer evening. I am pleased to announce the mystery has now been solved. Last night at approximately 8:15 p.m., detectives from the Essex County Prosecutor's Office, the Newark Police Department, the New Jersey State Police arrested Lee Anthony Evans, age 56, of Irvington, and Philander Hampton, age 53, of Jersey City, for the alleged murders of the 5 teenage boys that went missing in Newark back in the summer of 1978. For years, their families have wondered what happened on that August day. Today, we believe that question has been answered.
Major funding for due process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. And by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by the PSCG Foundation and the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation.